Hello all. This video is mostly for people that I've trained and that I've been training about a change in a procedure that we use. But this very well may be of interest to anyone who is interested in my videos, wants to understand better what I do, how we work, how you best approach the mind to resolve things and be more the way you want to be. Now, specifically, what we're changing a little bit here, what we're addressing is what I call the procedure or technique for resolving what I call stubbornly held protective attitudes or stubbornly held defensive beliefs or attitudes. You could put it any of those ways. It works. It covers it. Now, to summarize for those of you who may be new to this language, by stubbornly held protective attitude, what I really mean is, psychology has a term, defense mechanism, which fits just fine, although we're going to be a little more descriptive than that. And I have been involved in Scientology in the past. I was trained as a Scientology counselor, which they call an auditor, and many of you who watch my videos and have been trained by me and have had sessions with me also have a Scientology background. I think that that makes it easier for you to work with me because I'm familiar with the whole system and the language and so forth. Well, the Scientology term for this defense mechanism is the least descriptive of all. I'll explain that in a moment. But what we mean by defense mechanism or stubbornly held protective attitude is an attitude we sort of internally program. We decide from now on, I'm going to be this way about that. And it is defensive. It is intended to protect oneself. At its root, you could say the core purpose of stubbornly held protective attitude is to defend or protect from being hurt, from being made to feel unacceptable, not worthy, rejected, abandoned, unloved, not worthy of attention, not accepted. And all stubbornly held protective attitudes are basically rooted in trying to protect against that in so many ways. And so we come up with an idea which is basically some form of, I'm not going there under any circumstance. It can be, I'm not going to feel this. I'm always going to be this way. And I'm not going to accept this circumstance, never do this. Taking on dismissive attitudes for the most part. The term Scientology uses for this, and Scientology's understanding is the most superficial of all. In the Scientology system, this mechanism is described as something that people use to make other people wrong and make themselves right. And that is sometimes a peripheral characteristic, but the real point of that would be to protect oneself against being unaccepted. You know, a lot of our stubbornly held protective attitudes are ideas like, I'm going to maintain a certain level of anxiety. I need to have this anxiety because it keeps me alert and it protects me from disappointment, from being surprised, from being caught off my guard. That's an example of one. And of course, none of these really work very well. They actually burden us, and they actually accomplish exactly what they're intended to prevent. And they prevent exactly what they're intended to accomplish. So an attitude we all seem to have, in my experience working with people, it seems like we all have some form of, I need this anxiety to keep me alert and awake and to protect me. Seems like we all have some form of that. I've heard so many variations of that. It keeps me on my toes, whatever. The more core stubbornly held protective attitude would be something like, I'm going to be condescending and dismissive and distant so that nobody can hurt my feelings, abandon, reject me, get too intimate with me, and then hurt me. Seems like everyone has various forms of that. Again, it's basically a dismissive attitude, one way or another of saying, I'm not going there in relation to something. And of course, what the one I just described accomplishes is it keeps you from ever enjoying intimacy with anyone by keeping them away. So it's very self-defeating. And it seems like everybody's got some version of that needs to be unraveled. And unraveling stubbornly held protective attitudes is a very basic and important part of the work we do in your sessions with me, Dex. And I guess the next thing I want to cover, since I'm going to try to be all-encompassing, pervasive in describing all of this, the way to effectively and relevantly process your stubbornly held protective attitudes, it's going to matter the most, be the most relevant, make the most difference, is to take them up when they present themselves. And they do present themselves in sessions. Two basic ways. Sometimes a person will just utter the phrase that is obviously a stubbornly held protective attitude. At least obvious to me with my experience, with my intuition, with my empathy, feeling that kind of energy. I mean, the energy of a stubbornly held protective attitude is defensive. It's stubborn, it's defiant, it's sort of a refusal. It's very rigid. So it's not too hard to feel. If you're going to do this kind of work, and the more you do it, you're going to feel the other person's attitudes, feelings, and energies, which is part of picking up on it. And the way these show themselves is when I'm helping a client to process some flavor of fear or anxiety or other undesirable feeling. And something could happen. For instance, all of a sudden, they can't contact that feeling. What I've discovered through the work I do over the years is that I can't always springs from an I won't. And I won't is a form of resistance. In other words, a stubbornly held protective or defensive attitude. So in a session where we're taking up whatever arises in you to be taken up, but I call following your spiritual compass, because the only valid purpose of doing this kind of work, of what you call it, therapy or healing or whatever word you may use, is to help the other person or facilitate the other person's accomplishing of what they are here participating in the session with the hopes or expectations of accomplishing, as opposed to some pro forma program or system where, first we do this and then we do that without regard for the individual's particular needs, desires, or demands. Okay, now that describes many things, including Scientology, among other things, where there's a system in place of, we're going to do a certain number of techniques, all addressing this subject. Then we're going to move on from that to another level, which is the next subject. These are not nearly as satisfying or as helpful as taking up right now what you want to take up, what's bothering you, what you feel you need to change to be the way you want to be and the way you feel you should be, and not be a way that you don't feel you should be or don't want to be, simply put. So it does come up when we're processing some undesirable feeling of anxiety or fear or pain, where it seems to be successful. In fact, it is successful, and that feeling's no longer present. Now, that feeling should not trouble you again, that same feeling. If it does, if it comes back, it tends to come back very quickly. And if it does, it doesn't mean the process has failed. It means that it's uncovered a stubbornly held protective attitude that says something like, this fear protects me. I need to maintain this anxiety. And so when these show themselves by presenting the very feelings that have been processed, by bringing them back, by holding them in place, then we know we've got one of these attitudes there. Every time, always turns out to be, and it's very accessible. When that happens, I will just ask, is there some thought or attitude or idea you have that says that you must maintain this feeling, that you need this anxiety, whatever the feeling is? And it's almost immediately, if not immediately, the answer springs to mind from you, from the person in the session with me. And like I said, it could be this anxiety keeps me on my toes, or whatever that may be, and thus presenting itself. So it's now going to make a big difference to unravel that attitude. And for that, I do have the technique for resolving stubbornly held protective attitudes, aka stubbornly held rigid beliefs, aka stubbornly held defensive attitudes. All means the same thing, obviously. And so what I'm really here to talk about, particularly for all the people I've trained and all the people I am training, is to make you aware that I've realized or recognized that we need to make a change in this procedure. And the reason for that change I will explain, but first I will tell you what the change is. In the steps for handling a stubbornly held protective attitude, there is, you go through the different parts of step 3. The last part of step 3 results in your being free from this belief or attitude. It's discarded. It's no longer present. The change is that as soon as that's accomplished, we move off of that procedure and back to taking up the feeling that it was holding in place for you. So now we can fully be done with that anxiety, that panic, that worry, that tension, that stress, whatever that feeling may have been, and stay in line with your spiritual compass. We're taking up this feeling because it arose in you. Your spiritual compass, as I would call it, is bringing it to the surface to say, here's something to process. Here's something that's getting in the way of how you want to feel and how you want to be. And again, that's the most valid thing in the world to take up, is what's actually presenting within you. So that's why we then take up the stubbornly held protective attitude that is now presenting, if it is, to keep that feeling in place or bring it back, that feeling that you don't want to have of anxiety or whatever. So we are staying on course, on the path of your own instincts, of what you are bringing up, what your spiritual compass is presenting when we take up that stubbornly held protective attitude. So with the completion of the third step, step 3D, technically, and now you've discarded with that attitude, you're free of that attitude and you know it. As I said, now we just go right back to processing, to resolving the feeling, the anxiety, apprehension, whatever feeling that attitude was maintaining for you. That's a change, because the way we've been doing this technique, the way I wrote it, was we then look for any underlying circumstance or condition that has been in place that brought you to, provoked you, or inspired you to adopt and internally program that belief or that attitude. Now we're not doing that anymore. We're not searching for something underlying that, for two reasons. The first reason being that there are steps within step 3 where we take up the moments and circumstances and conditions and situations where this attitude we've been processing would be employed already. The second reason is the bigger reason, and it's that we just want to stick with what your spiritual compass is presenting. We want to stay as true to that as possible, because that's where your spirit, where your mind, where your heart is taking you. That's what you're here for. Not to clean out anything and everything that may be lurking somewhere back there and may not be relevant, because if it's not coming to mind, how relevant could it be? So we're not turning this into an exercise of scouring the mind of things that are not getting in the way of your spiritual compass presently. I'll give you an analogy for Scientologists of another example of how you can take a long, unnecessary, complicated runway, or you can just stay on the path, on the course, without going off to try and handle everything that may not even be relevant. In Scientology, there's something used that's called word clearing. And it goes like this, basically, for our purposes. I'm summarizing a part of it, which is you come across a word you don't understand, you get a dictionary, and you look up or clear that word. You look up the definition, you clear that word for the specific usage in the context in which it came up. Now, what could make more sense than that? Of course, that's great. It's called using a dictionary. That's why they made dictionaries, and they made dictionaries long before there was Scientology. Scientology didn't invent dictionaries. But in Scientology, the way the word clearing works is instead of having defined the word as it's used in that context and continuing on the immediate relevant path of whatever you're reading or studying, now that you understand that word in that sentence and you can continue, in Scientology, it's sort of turned into what can be a lengthy vocabulary lesson. I mean, a word could have 30 definitions. In Scientology, you must go through a process to clear, define, demonstrate, and go over every single definition that word has. Now, hey, that could be fun. It's educational, and shouldn't be detrimental, but it's way off the path and way off the course when your purpose is to understand what you're reading or what somebody said. It's not to try and arrive at a point where you know what everything means in every context. That can get ridiculous. So that's one of my arguments with Scientology's part of their, what they call their study technology or their study tech, is all of that. You know, it becomes a trap. And I know the feeling, as many of you do who have experienced Scientology, of, oh my God, I came across a misunderstood word, and now I'm going to be hung up in clearing every definition, using it all in sentences in that definition, demonstrating the idea, and spending God knows how long before you get back to the point of what you're reading. I mean, that's really quite a detour. It can be quite a detour. And for the most part, it's not what we want to do, you know. But this is that idea of staying on the course and on the trail of what you're doing, what's relevant, matters so much more when it comes to in a session context, you know, a healing context or a therapeutic context. You're trying to resolve feelings and attitudes that are disturbing you and preventing you from being the way you want to be. You really don't want to go through extra steps. You want to stay on the course of what will most readily accomplish that. You don't want to waste a lot of time, invest a lot of money in going off a detour from there, which is what happens quite frequently in Scientology. And maybe it's part of my past Scientology background that I hadn't quite gotten cleaned out, you know, that I had steps like that in there to go and look for things that could have inspired, or the conditions or whatever that could have brought about that attitude. We've covered it well enough. You've discarded the attitude. That's the point. And we just want to move on. So for those of you that I've been training or have trained in resolving stubbornly held protective attitudes, when step 3D is accomplished, you move right on to the feeling that was being processed to unravel and continue on the way with addressing what the person in front of you in the session, what their spiritual compass is presenting, what they're bringing up, because that's coming up as something they need to resolve. We want to streamline Stay in the flow of the session. Stay in the flow of what's presenting through the other person's mind. Stay in the flow of their spiritual compass. I'll tell you, this came up for me. Why I've made this change and why I recognize it should be made is when I noticed just a few days ago in one session with a client where we processed the stubbornly held protective attitude she had on that step 3D. It was gone for her. And her mind naturally went, she told me, now I'm back to that feeling of, let's say it was anxiety. Now I'm back to that. And now I'm finishing digesting that, and then she very quickly said, and now that's gone. So you see, that was her spiritual compass acting as perfectly as our spiritual compass always does. Saying, okay, discarded the attitude, back to that feeling. It didn't go to, well, can we find some other or deeper thing that could have brought this attitude about? No. So I learned from that experience there. Stay with the spiritual compass. And just almost immediately, the issue, the anxiety or worry or tension that person was feeling was then finally and fully resolved. See, this is one of the ways that I readily learn how to be better at what I'm doing, how to make the techniques I use more effective and better and more relevant and more to the point, was from observing how people's minds work, how your spiritual compass presents things. And this was such an example. So we're doing away with everything after step 3D, because we always want to go in the direction of straightforward with what your mind is presenting, with what the spiritual compass is presenting, as opposed to the way some other things work. A couple of other points to be more circumspect. I explained how the way to find a stubbornly held protective attitude to process is that it's in need of processing, and it shows that by presenting itself in the circumstances that I've already described, where the person in the session with me or you utters the phrase that's obviously a stubbornly held protective attitude of, like, I never trust this or that, whatever it might be. Anyway, or comes up because something that's been processed is somehow brought back, is recreated, some undesirable feeling. That is, again, an absolute red flag. It's an indicator of stubbornly held protective attitude. I shouldn't say red flag, it's a good thing. We don't think of red flags as good things, but it's presenting something to process that's really going to make a difference. I will say, as opposed to Scientology, where they have that very superficial understanding of this defense mechanism, of this stubbornly held protective attitude, they call it a service facsimile, or abbreviate or cut it short to SERFAC. Service facsimile. And I won't go into great details in the Scientology superficial understanding, I should say misunderstanding, of it simply being something a person uses to make other people wrong or make themselves right, or to dominate others, or to escape domination. Any method for seeking out this mechanism is flawed, because you take it up when the spiritual compass is actually presenting it. Not with the idea that, well, let's clean out all your stubbornly held protective attitudes, all your defense mechanisms. That's what we're going to do now. You can't. It doesn't work. And what you do come up with will be relatively superficial. When you're helping the person process some undesirable feeling and something keeps putting it back in place, now you've got something to process that's going to make a difference. Okay? Now it's not some superficial exercise. In Scientology, they use questions to find these things on what they call a certain level. Not a big believer in levels. The mind isn't organized in levels. It's organized in whatever the spiritual compass brings up next. Whatever comes to your mind, that's what's relevant. But they ask questions such as something like, what do you use to make yourself right? What do you use to make others wrong? And you can get some answers to those questions, and they can be applicable, but they tend not to run as deep, and they're just not as relevant because they weren't presenting in the first place. And I'll go a little bit further on the subject of long runways and how should I put it? I made a note here about this. Overlong session procedures, that's the phrase I wanted to use, which you find in Scientology. Like one example is you could spend 2 hours doing what they call a repair list. When something's come up in a session that is getting in the way of what's supposed to be happening. And it could take 2 hours to get through this 50, 60, 70, 80 questions that might be asked and assessed in an attempt to find and resolve whatever seems to be getting in the way. Of course, from a better perspective, from a truer perspective, what's quote unquote getting in the way is actually what needs to present, because it's the most relevant thing that's coming up in the person's mind. And it's a wonderful opportunity to fully process something. In Scientology, you say the word repair list and people groan, whether, audibly or internally. Repair lists are not something, it's a very overlong procedure. Like I said, 50, 60, 70 questions trying to find something. How about just asking the person what's going on, what's happening, what are you feeling? I mean, that's what I would do. And I wouldn't consider it to be something that's a problem getting in the way. I'd recognize it's an opportunity to take up something that's right there for the person. I certainly wouldn't ask 76 questions about it, make the person sit through that and pay for that time. Nobody wants to do that, Scientology. Nobody wants to do that. I'm thinking of one example right now. It's very funny. Back in the days when I was giving Scientology sessions as a Scientology auditor, and a certain phenomena appeared on this device they use in the sessions called an e-meter, a very high tone arm reading on the meter, which means, what it really means is a lot of resistance. And it was called a false TA checklist. Go through a lot of questions, nothing's working, nothing's changing that. I go through the whole list with the person. I don't know what to do next. And then he says, would it be all right if I used the bathroom? And that brought the indications on the device, the e-meter, way back down to where it needed to be. Yes, please go use the bathroom. You need Scientology on your false TA checklist, by the way. If you're going to do those overlong session procedures like that, at least put on your false TA checklist, do you need to use the restroom? Helpful hint. And there's a lot of clients of mine have also done what I would consider sort of Scientology 2.0. It's an upgrade, but it's not out of the realm of the attitudes and ideas of Scientology. It's called knowledgeism. And knowledgeism is an improvement on Scientology. I would say it's halfway between, a completely wonderful way to work and Scientology. But like Scientology, knowledgeism does contain a lot of overlong session procedures. Those of you who spend much time in knowledgeism, you see these certain procedures that can have over 50, 60, or 70 steps to them. We just want to take up what the spiritual compass is presenting, just fully process that, take up anything that brings up, but not go off the path to try to, clean out everything and anything that seems related to the subject at hand. We don't want to clear 44 definitions of a word in a dictionary when we only need the one that fits in the context of the word we need to understand from the conversation or the book we're reading. Stay in the flow. Don't take a long detour. Nobody likes that. Nobody needs that. Especially when not only time, but money is involved because you're paying for that time. And with that, we circle back to, that's why I've made this change in the procedure for the technique for resolving stubbornly held protective attitudes. When the attitude is discarded, we're done. The steps that were in place after that, not needed. And we're going to do a better job thereby of paralleling your mind, of staying in your flow of your mind, being more efficient, more effective, and more relevant. Hope you enjoyed this talk, and you can reach me through my website, dexsessions.com. It's DEXSESSIONS.com. Ask any questions you have, arrange for sessions. I'll be very happy to work with you, and thank you for listening.